April 1241, Western Poland. The greatest military machine the world had ever seen was about to collide with the flower of European chivalry. What happened over the next 3 days would shatter the myth of European invincibility and leave a scar on the collective memory of Christendom that would last for centuries. The Mongols had come. To understand the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must first understand who these Mongols were. They were not the barbaric horde that European chroniclers would later describe. They were the inheritors of Genghis Khan's revolutionary military system, a force that had conquered from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe in just 2 generations. Every Mongol warrior could ride before he could properly walk. He could shoot a bow with deadly accuracy at full gallop. He could survive on mare's milk and dried meat for weeks, covering distances that European armies thought impossible. By 1241, the Mongol Empire stretched from China to the gates of Europe. The great cities of Central Asia had fallen. The Islamic world's most powerful kingdoms had been crushed. The supposedly impregnable Great Wall of China had proven useless. Now under Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, 3 Tumans, 30,000 of the most disciplined warriors on earth, had already devastated Kiev, the jewel of the Ruslans, and torn through Hungary like a tornado through wheat. The Mongol invasion of Europe was not random violence. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of conquest. Batu Khan had divided his forces. One army ravaged Hungary. Another moved through Poland, systematically destroying any force that could threaten the Mongol flanks. They had already burned Lublin, sacked Sander, and left Kov a smoking ruin. Now they turned towards Siscia, one of Poland's richest duchies. Duke Henry II of Silesia, called Henry the Pious for his devotion to the church, knew what was coming. He was no fool. Desperate messages had arrived from the east, each more terrifying than the last. Entire cities reduced to ash in single days, populations massacred down to the last child, armies that had stood for centuries obliterated in hours. The messages spoke of devils on horseback who fought with supernatural coordination, who appeared from nowhere and disappeared like smoke. But Henry was no coward. He was a veteran commander who had fought in numerous campaigns. More importantly, he understood that if the Mongols were not stopped here, all of Europe lay open before them. He sent urgent messages across Poland, Moravia, and the German states. The response was unprecedented. The Knights Templar, those legendary warrior monks who had fought in the Crusades, answered the call. The Teutonic Knights, fresh from their campaigns in the Baltic, marched south with their heavy cavalry. Polish nobility from across the fragmented kingdom put aside their feuds and gathered their retinues. Duke Mieszko of Opel brought his entire force. Moravian infantry marched north. Even gold miners from the rich Silesian mines, men who had never held a sword, volunteered to defend Christendom. Contemporary chronicles written by terrified monks claimed 100,000 men stood ready to face the Mongol threat. This was almost certainly an exaggeration born of fear and hope. Modern historians studying the logistics and population records suggest the real number was closer to 25,000 or 40,000, but even that smaller figure represented one of the largest European armies of the medieval period. To put this in perspective, William the Conqueror had conquered England with perhaps 10,000 men. The largest armies of the Third Crusade barely exceeded 30,000. Against them stood perhaps 20,000 Mongols, 2 Tumans under the command of Bar and Kadan. The Europeans had numerical superiority. They had heavier armor, the finest metallurgy in the world at that time. They had the blessing of the Pope. They had God on their side, or so they believed. They would need all of it, and it would not be enough. The Mongol commanders Bar and Kadan were not the barbarians of European imagination, but military geniuses trained in the art of war since childhood. Bidar was a grandson of Genghis Khan, raised in the tradition of the great conqueror. Kadan was the son of Ugay Khan, the great Khan himself. These were not mere raiders, but strategic thinkers who had studied European tactics for years through their intelligence network. Yes, the Mongols had spies throughout Europe, often disguised as merchants. They knew exactly how European armies fought. The mounted knight was the tank of medieval warfare. Hundreds of pounds of man, armor, and horse concentrated into a devastating charge that could shatter any infantry line. But the Mongols also knew the weaknesses. Knights were slow. Their horses tired quickly under the weight. They fought for personal glory, often breaking formation to pursue individual combat. Most critically, European armies depended on close combat, while Mongol doctrine emphasized killing the enemy before he could reach you. Dayfrain, April 7th, 1241. The European army advanced from Lanika in traditional formation. a sight that would have stirred any medieval heart. In the center rode the heavy cavalry, knights in chainmail and early plate armor, their helmets gleaming, lances held high. Each knight's armor alone cost as much as a village might produce in a year. Their war horses, massive destriers bred for strength rather than speed, snorted and stamped, eager for battle. On the flanks marched the infantry, Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, Silesian miners with improvised weapons. They sang hymns as they marched, their voices carrying across the plains. Priests moved through the ranks, blessing weapons and offering absolution. Banners flew, the Black Cross of the Teutonic Order, the Red Cross of the Templars, the White Eagle of Poland. It was a magnificent sight, the concentrated military might of Eastern European Christendom. Then on the horizon dust. Not the dust of another army marching, but something different, lighter, faster, wrong, somehow. The first Mongol riders appeared like ghosts, light cavalry on small ugly horses that looked like ponies compared to the European war horses. The knights laughed. These were the terrifying Mongols. These small men on their small horses. They looked like they could be ridden down in a single charge. The Mongol riders came within arrow range, but not European arrow range. Mongol composite bows made from horn, sinew, and wood could accurately strike at 350 meters, far beyond the range of European crossbows. The riders fired, their arrows arcing high into the sky, then wheeled their horses and retreated. "Cowards!" the Polish knights shouted. "They run like rabbits, like women." But running was exactly what the Mongols wanted. This was not cowardice, but calculated tactical doctrine. For hours, wave after wave of horse archers harassed the European lines. They would ride in fire and retreat before the heavy cavalry could respond. Each Mongol carried 60 arrows in their quivers, with supply horses carrying hundreds more. 20,000 men times 60 arrows equals 1.2 million projectiles. The mathematics of death. The Europeans raised their shields and endured, but the psychological effect was devastating. Knights were trained for glorious charges, for the clash of steel on steel, for honorable single combat. Instead, they stood like targets while enemies they couldn't reach slowly bled them. Horses screamed as arrows found gaps in their armor. Men cursed as shafts penetrated mail at the joints. The infantry with less armor suffered even more. Duke Henry ordered his crossbowmen to respond, but it was futile. By the time they had cranked their crossbows for a shot, the Mongols were out of range. The Templars requested permission to charge. Henry refused. He knew that's what the Mongols wanted, to draw his forces out piecemeal and destroy them. But holding formation while being slowly shot to pieces was destroying morale. As the sun began to set on that first day, the true horror of Mongol warfare became clear. This would not be a glorious battle, but a grinding slaughter. By nightfall, hundreds of Europeans were dead or wounded. Men with arrows in their shoulders, legs, faces, horses had to be put down. The screaming of the wounded filled the camp. The Mongols had lost perhaps a dozen men, mostly from lucky crossbow shots. They made camp just out of sight, their signal fires twinkling like stars fallen to earth. All night, Mongol drummers beat their war drums, keeping the Europeans awake, fraying their nerves. Day 2, April 8th, 1241. Dawn came blood red, an omen that even the priests struggled to explain away. The European army, exhausted from a sleepless night, formed ranks again. Many wounded men had died during the night and morale was cracking. Arguments broke out between the Polish nobles and the Templar commanders about tactics. The Teutonic Knights demanded an immediate charge. Duke Mieszko of Oppen threatened to withdraw his forces if they continued to stand and be slaughtered like cattle. Henry knew he had to act. When Mongol riders appeared again at dawn, using the same harassment tactics, he made a fateful decision. He ordered Duke Mieszko to lead a partial cavalry charge. Not the entire force, but enough to drive off the horse archers and perhaps capture some for interrogation. 2,000 of Poland's finest knights thundered forward. The ground shook under the weight of their charge. Lances lowered, shields raised. They were an avalanche of steel and flesh. The Mongol light cavalry, apparently panicked by this display of force, turned and fled. The Europeans pursued their blood up, hungry for revenge after yesterday's humiliation. "We have them!" Mieszko shouted. "Press forward. Glory to Christ. Kill them all." The pursuit stretched for miles. The European horses carrying armoured men began to tire, but the Mongols always seemed just out of reach, occasionally turning to fire a few arrows, spurring the knights to greater effort. Some Polish nobles began to suspect a trap, but Mieszko, consumed with battle fury, pushed onward. It was exactly what the Mongols had been waiting for. The feigned retreat, the Mongols' signature tactic perfected over decades of warfare. As the Polish cavalry became strung out over miles of pursuit, their formation completely broken, the traps sprung with terrifying precision. Mongol heavy cavalry. Yes, the Mongols had heavy cavalry too, something the Europeans hadn't expected, emerged from hidden positions in the rolling terrain. Light cavalry units that had been circling unseen now closed in from all sides. Duke Meshko realized his fatal error, but it was too late. His force was surrounded, cut off from the main army, isolated on the open steppe where European knights had no advantage. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic execution. The Mongols didn't engage in heroic close combat. They circled the trapped Europeans like wolves around sheep, pouring arrows into the mass of men and horses. When knights tried to break out, they were driven back by coordinated charges. When they stood still, they were shot to pieces. The Mongol heavy cavalry, when they did charge, did so only when the enemy was already weakened and disorganized. Duke Mishko himself fought valiantly. Accounts say he personally killed a dozen Mongols before 5 arrows brought him down. His bodyguards made a last stand around his fallen body, singing death songs, but they were overwhelmed. Of the 2,000 knights who had charged that morning, fewer than 200 made it back to Henry's camp. The survivors were traumatized, some driven mad by what they had witnessed. They spoke of demons who fought with supernatural coordination, who seemed to communicate without words, who killed without mercy or honor. One knight, his armor pierced by 7 arrows, died repeating, "They are not men. They are not men." That night the Mongols sent a message to Henry's camp. It was Duke Meshko's head preserved in salt with a simple note in broken Latin. Tomorrow you. Day 3, April 9th, 1241. The day of annihilation. Henry's war council that morning was a scene of barely controlled panic. He had lost nearly a quarter of his army. The Moravian infantry were on the verge of desertion. Several Polish nobles had already fled during the night with their retinues. But Henry knew that retreat was impossible. The Mongols would run them down on the open plains. The only choice was to stand and fight, to make one last desperate battle. Henry chose his ground carefully. A field near the village of Leniki Pole, Lenica Field. It had a slight rise that would give his archers an advantage and a stream on one flank that would prevent encirclement. He arranged his forces in a defensive formation. The Templars and Teutonic Knights formed the center. These religious warriors would not flee. Polish knights took the right wing, the remaining infantry the left. Henry himself commanded the reserve. As the morning mist cleared, the Mongols appeared. But something was different. They weren't moving in their usual fluid formations. Instead, they seemed to be setting up strange devices, large pots or cauldrons mounted on wheels. The Europeans watched, puzzled. Were these some kind of cooking pots? Were the pagans performing some ritual? Then the battle began, and the true horror of Mongol innovation was revealed. The devices were Chinese gunpowder weapons, not cannons. Those were still decades away, but smoke generators. The Mongols had learned this technology during their conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China. As the European army advanced, the Mongols ignited these devices, creating massive clouds of thick, choking smoke that rolled across the battlefield. Within minutes, the carefully organized European formation began to dissolve. Men couldn't see more than a few feet. Commands couldn't be heard over the coughing and confusion. Units lost contact with each other. Banners, the medieval command and control system, disappeared in the smoke. Knights stumbled into their own infantry. Horses panicked by the smoke became uncontrollable. Then came the psychological masterstroke. Days earlier, the Mongols had captured Polish prisoners and forced them to learn one phrase in Polish. Ucisko stra runol is lost. Now in the smoke and confusion, Mongol warriors who had learned these words shouted them across the battlefield. Polish soldiers, unable to see through the smoke, hearing what sounded like Polish voices, believed their own commanders were ordering retreat. Panic spread like plague. Men began to run, colliding with others trying to hold formation. The infantry on the left wing broke first, streaming away from the battlefield. This exposed the center, where the Templars and Teutonic Knights stood firm. But they were now isolated islands in a sea of chaos. The Mongols attacked with perfect coordination. How they maintained unit cohesion in the smoke remains a mystery. Perhaps they used drums or horns at frequencies that cut through the chaos. Or perhaps they had simply practiced this tactic so many times that each unit knew its role by heart. Light cavalry struck from the flanks, pouring arrows into the confused mass. Heavy cavalry smashed into broken units, shattering them completely. The Knights Templar fought with the courage of men who believed they were earning martyrdom, surrounded, outnumbered, unable to see their enemies until they were almost upon them. They stood in a circle and fought to the last man. Their grandmaster Pon Dobon was found after the battle with 23 arrows in his body, his sword broken, surrounded by Mongol dead. The Teutonic Knights attempted to cut their way out, forming a wedge and charging blindly through the smoke. They actually broke through the Mongol lines only to find themselves in open country with Mongol cavalry in pursuit. They were run down one by one, their heavy armor becoming a death trap as their exhausted horses collapsed. Duke Henry, seeing his army disintegrating, made the fatal decision to try to rally his forces. He rode forward with his personal banner, trying to create a rallying point. For a moment it seemed to work. Polish knights began to converge on his position. Then, a Mongol arrow fired by an unknown archer struck him in the armpit, where his armor plates joined. He swayed in his saddle but stayed mounted, trying to continue fighting. His bodyguards closed around him, attempting to get him off the battlefield, but the Mongols had marked him as the commander. They concentrated their entire force on this small group. Henry's guards died one by one. Finally, Henry himself, weakened by blood loss, fell from his horse. Seeing their duke fall, the last organized resistance collapsed. It became a rout, then a slaughter. The Mongols pursued the fleeing Europeans for miles, cutting them down as they ran. Armored knights threw away their armor to run faster. Proud nobles begged for mercy in languages the Mongols didn't understand, or chose not to understand. Duke Henry, still alive but mortally wounded, was captured. The Mongol commanders, following the tradition of honoring brave enemies, offered him a quick death. He refused, saying he would die as he had lived as a Christian knight. The Mongols obliged. His head was cut off and placed on a spear, later paraded around the city of Lenica as proof of victory. His mother, searching the battlefield days later, could only identify his body by his polyactyly. He had been born with 6 toes on his left foot. By noon on April 9th, it was over. The scale of the catastrophe was almost incomprehensible. The Mongols, following their custom, cut off the right ear of each slain enemy to count the dead. They filled 9 large leather sacks. Contemporary accounts claim between 10,000 and 25,000 European dead. Virtually the entire nobility of Sicily had been eliminated. The Templars and Teutonic Knights had lost so many brothers that it would take a generation to rebuild their numbers. Entire family lines that had ruled for centuries were extinguished in a single morning. The Mongol casualties, modern historians estimate less than 700 men, and many of those were from the heavy cavalry used in the final charges. The battlefield itself was a vision of hell. Bodies lay so thick that in places you could walk for hundreds of yards without touching the ground. Carrion birds circled in clouds so thick they blocked the sun. The stench could be smelled for miles. Local peasants would find bones in their fields for decades afterward. In just 3 days, a smaller Mongol force had completely annihilated one of the largest European armies ever assembled. But the Battle of Lenica was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe that shattered European confidence and changed the course of history. News of the disaster spread across Europe like wildfire. In Paris, King Louis Ned immediately began strengthening the city's walls and training his army in new tactics. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to defend Europe itself from these devil's horsemen. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, locked in his own conflict with the Pope, suddenly found both sides willing to discuss peace in the face of this external threat. Letters from this period reveal the depth of European terror. One German chronicler wrote, "The Mongols are the punishment of God for our sins. They fight not as men fight with honor and courage, but as demons fight with cunning and cruelty. Our knights, the finest warriors in Christendom, were as children before them." The psychological impact went beyond military concerns. The Mongols had demonstrated that the entire basis of European feudal military power, the mounted knight, was obsolete against a disciplined, tactically superior force. The elaborate codes of chivalry, the individual heroism, the honor-based combat that defined European warfare meant nothing against an enemy who fought to win by any means necessary. Fortunately for Europe, salvation came from an unexpected source. In December 1241, 8 months after Legica, the great Khan Ugai died in Mongolia. He had been drinking heavily. Some sources suggest he was poisoned and died suddenly during a hunting trip. By Mongol law, all members of the royal family had to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan. Batu Khan, frustrated but obedient to tradition, withdrew his armies from Europe. The Mongols would never penetrate this far into Europe again. Political struggles in Mongolia, the vast distances involved, and the eventual fragmentation of the Mongol Empire meant that the threat gradually receded. But the lesson had been burned into European consciousness with fire and blood. The Battle of Legica forced a revolution in European military thinking. Within a generation, European armies began adopting combined arms tactics, improving their archery, and developing early gunpowder weapons. The age of the mounted knights, absolute supremacy on the battlefield, was beginning its long, slow end. Professional armies would gradually replace feudal levies. Tactics and discipline would become more important than individual valor. Some historians argue that Lenica saved Europe by teaching it harsh lessons just in time. When the Ottoman Turks, inheritors of many Mongol military traditions, threatened Europe 2 centuries later, European armies were ready with combined arms, gunpowder weapons, and professional discipline. The Europe that faced the Ottomans was not the Europe that had faced the Mongols. The Mongols had taught Europe a lesson written in blood: adapt or die, evolution through catastrophe, and they had taught it in just 3 days. Today, the Battle of Lenica is remembered differently by different nations. In Poland, it's a national tragedy, but also a source of pride. Their ancestors stood against impossible odds to defend Europe. In Mongolia, it's celebrated as one of the greatest tactical victories in military history. In Military Me's Worldwide, it's studied as a perfect example of how superior tactics and discipline can overcome numerical superiority and technological advantages. The battlefield itself is now peaceful farmland. A small monument stands where Duke Henry is believed to have fallen. Every year on April 9th, historical reenactors gather to commemorate the battle. They wear accurate armor, carry replica weapons, and try to recreate the tactics of both sides. But no reenactment can capture the terror of that smoke-filled morning when the medieval world order died on the plains of Clasea. The echo of those Mongol horses' hoofbeats still resonates through history. They remind us that no empire, no matter how powerful, no system, no matter how entrenched, is immune to sudden catastrophic change. The Mongols didn't just defeat an army at Lenica. They shattered a worldview, ended an era, and forced an entire civilization to evolve or perish. All in just 3 days. 3 days that changed the world forever.